You grew up watching westerns where Native Americans were villains or just background characters. Hollywood made billions off that lie. But military files and mission records tell a different story. Empires that rivaled Rome. War codes that defeated Nazis. Massacres the government buried for decades. These 20 facts show what they tried to erase from school textbooks. Subscribe to our channel and comment where you're watching us from. Number 1. Long before Columbus set foot on the continent, a metropolis already ruled the heart of America. Cahokia, on the banks of the Mississippi, had around 20,000 people around 1050, more people than London at the same time. The inhabitants built huge earthen pyramids, some larger than the Egyptian ones in area, organized a sophisticated agricultural system, and created a trade network that reached the Gulf of Mexico. The city worked as the political and religious center of the whole region. But here's the part no one talks about in school textbooks. This civilization collapsed before Europeans arrived. Overpopulation, depleted soil, and internal conflicts turned the biggest city north of Mexico into silent ruins. When colonizers showed up centuries later, they found only vegetation-covered mounds of earth, with no idea what had existed there. Number 2. During World War II, the United States had a serious problem. The Japanese were breaking all the military codes. Then someone had an idea that changed everything. They recruited young men from the Navajo Nation to create something no enemy could crack. And it worked. These guys came up with over 400 terms using their native language, one of the most complex on the planet. Submarine became ironfish. Bomb was egg. The Japanese intercepted the messages and were completely lost. Not even Tokyo's best cryptographers came close to understanding a single word. These men served in every major Pacific battle, from Guadalcanal to Iwo Jima. But when they came home, nobody could know what they did. The program was too secret. It took more than 50 years for the government to finally recognize these veterans. Only in 2000 did they receive the Congressional Gold Medal. Want to dig deeper into hidden chapters of American history like this? I put together a collection of historical dossiers packed with primary sources and overlooked details that textbooks and Hollywood skip. If you prefer raw facts over sanitized stories, check the pinned comment. It might surprise you. Number 3. Before the Founding Fathers wrote a single word of the Constitution, the Haudenosaunee had already been practicing democracy for centuries. This confederacy of 6 indigenous nations in the northeastern United States ran on a system that feels familiar. Representatives from each tribe met in council, debated proposals, and any nation could veto decisions that affected its people. Benjamin Franklin knew this model well. In 1754, he proposed the Albany Plan to unite the colonies and openly admitted he was inspired by the Iroquois. Franklin even wondered how 6 nations could keep such a long-lasting union while a dozen English colonies couldn't agree with each other. Historians still debate how much the Constitution owes to the Haudenosaunee, but in 1988, Congress itself officially recognized this influence through a resolution. Number 4. When Columbus arrived in 1492, the Americas had around 100 million people. To give you an idea, that was more people than all of Europe at the time. 50 years later, that number dropped to under 10 million. What happened? Smallpox, measles, and the flu did the heavy lifting. Native people had no defenses against these diseases that came from across the ocean. Entire tribes disappeared before they ever even saw a European, because the diseases traveled faster than the conquerors. Here in the United States, it's estimated that between 10 and 18 million native people lived here before contact. When the 1900 census was taken, only 237,000 were left. The strange part is that for centuries, books taught that the Americas were empty lands. Only in recent decades have archaeologists started to reveal the truth. Cities, roads, advanced agriculture. A whole world that was erased. Number 5. The federal government ran more than 400 boarding schools for Native children between 1879 and 1978. The policy was straightforward: separate children from their families to wipe out tribal languages, religions, and traditions. Federal agents showed up on reservations and took boys and girls, some as young as 4. At the schools, they shaved their hair, banned native languages, and handed out harsh physical punishments. The founder of the system, Richard Pratt, summed up the philosophy in a line that became official: "Kill the Indian, save the man." Thousands of children never made it back home. Many died from disease, malnutrition, or abuse. Their bodies were buried in cemeteries at the institutions themselves, often without the families being notified. In 2021, digs at former schools in Canada and the United States started to uncover mass graves. The real number of deaths is still unknown to this day. Number 6. The ghost dance promised a world without white people. In 1890, a belief spread across native reservations like wildfire. A Paiute prophet named Wovoka had a vision. If native people danced in a circle for days in a row, dead ancestors would return. Bison would fill the plains again, and the settlers would simply disappear from the land. No war, no blood. White people would vanish, and everything would go back to how it was before. The Lakota Sioux grabbed onto that hope hard. They wore special shirts they believed could stop bullets. The federal government panicked. It saw that peaceful dance as a threat of rebellion. In December of that year, soldiers surrounded a camp at Wounded Knee, South Dakota. What happened there was a bloodbath. Around 300 men, women, and children were killed in minutes. The dance that promised salvation ended in tragedy. Number 7. Forget that idea that indigenous women only took care of household chores. The reality was very different. Among the Cherokee, power ran through women. Clans followed the maternal line, and, believe it or not, it was the elder women who voted on whether the tribe would go to war or not. Men could even lead the battles, but the final decision to take up arms, it came from them. And there were women who actually went to the battlefield. Lozan, an Apache woman, fought side by side with Geronimo in the last wars against the American army. The warriors themselves respected her as a strategist. She was known for an almost supernatural ability to detect the enemy's position. It wasn't an exception. Several tribes had women who chose the path of war. The Crow had woman chief, who led expeditions and was considered one of the greatest warriors of the nation. Women's roles in the tribes were much more complex than old books made it seem. Number 8. Imagine dozens of tribes who spoke completely different languages being able to make agreements, plan hunts, and even settle conflicts without saying a single spoken word. That happened on the Great Plains for centuries. Native people developed a hand signal system so effective it worked like a visual common language. It's estimated that more than 30 different tribes knew and used this code. It wasn't improvised pantomime. It was a structured vocabulary with thousands of signs that allowed long conversations on all kinds of topics. White traders who came to the region were impressed by how sophisticated the system was. Some learned the signs to make trading furs and horses easier. The most interesting part is that this sign language influenced researchers who later studied communication for deaf people. A social technology created on the American prairies that crossed cultures and generations. Number 9. Before Europeans arrived, the Iroquois were already playing lacrosse, but it wasn't a sport. It was training for real war. They called it the little brother of war, and there was a very clear reason for that. Picture 2 teams with hundreds of players on each side, on a field that could stretch for miles. There was no protective gear, none of that. The games lasted all day, from sunrise to sunset, and it was normal to leave with broken bones, knocked out teeth, and serious injuries. Sometimes tribes settled territorial disputes this way instead of going into an actual battle. Warriors built endurance, speed, and pain tolerance, exactly what they needed in combat. When the French first saw it in the 17th century, they were shocked by the violence. The game you know today in schools and universities is a completely tamed-down version of the original. Number 10. When the first colonizers arrived in America, they found peoples who had already mastered medical treatments for thousands of years. Native tribes knew that chewing willow bark eased headaches and fever. That knowledge was passed down generation to generation long before any pharmacy existed. Europeans watched, learned, and took that know-how back to the Old World. Centuries later, scientists isolated the active compound from that same bark and created what we now know as aspirin. One of the best-selling medicines in history came straight from indigenous knowledge. Beyond willow, tribes used hundreds of plants to treat infections, wounds, and digestive problems. Many of those treatments became the foundation of modern medicine. The next time you take an aspirin to ease a pain, remember that this cure already existed in the American forests more than 1,000 years ago. Want to dig deeper into hidden chapters of American history like this? I put together a collection of historical dossiers packed with primary sources and overlooked details that textbooks and Hollywood skip. If you prefer raw facts over sanitized stories, check the pinned comment, it might surprise you. Number 11. Long before Europeans set foot on this continent, slavery already existed among native peoples, that's right. Tribes captured members of rival tribes in battles and turned them into slaves. But here's the detail a lot of people don't know. This slavery worked differently. In many tribes, a slave could be adopted into a family, marry members of the tribe, and even earn their freedom. The children of slaves were usually born free. Among Pacific Northwest peoples, like the Haida and the Tlingit, it was harsher. Slaves were symbols of wealth and status. Powerful chiefs had dozens of them. When Europeans arrived, many tribes saw a business opportunity. Some started capturing rivals specifically to sell to the colonizers. The history of Native Americans is a lot more complex than what we were taught in school. Number 12. In 1680, the Spanish had controlled New Mexico for almost a century. They banned indigenous religious ceremonies and forced labor in the missions. The Pueblo seemed defeated, but they were planning something no one expected. A leader named Popé, from the Pueblo of Okai-Owingeh, secretly organized a coordinated revolt among dozens of villages that spoke different languages and rarely worked together. On the planned day, the Pueblo attacked at the same time across the whole region. They killed about 400 colonists and 21 Franciscan priests. The surviving Spaniards fled south, abandoning Santa Fe. For 12 years, the Pueblo ruled their own territory, destroyed churches, and restored their traditions. It was the only time indigenous people completely drove a European power out of a colonized region in North America. When the Spanish came back, they never again tried to ban native ceremonies. Number 13. Indigenous ancestors' skeletons are still locked away in museum storage rooms all across the country. For more than a century, American institutions collected human remains and sacred objects from native tribes without asking anyone's permission. It's estimated that U.S. museums hold more than 100,000 sets of indigenous ancestors' remains and about 1 million funerary items. In 1990, Congress passed a law requiring this material to be returned to the tribes. More than 3 decades later, most of it is still in the same places. The Smithsonian alone still has thousands of remains that haven't been returned. Tribes have to go through long bureaucratic processes to prove a connection to their own ancestors. Many museums claim they don't have the resources to catalog everything. Meanwhile, objects used in religious ceremonies sit in boxes far from the communities that created them, and that still need them to keep their traditions alive. Number 14. For centuries, the government took land, broke treaties, and pushed tribes onto reservations on land considered worthless. But in 1988, a federal law changed everything. The Indian Gaming Regulatory Act allowed tribes to run casinos on their sovereign lands. What seemed like a bureaucratic detail turned into a quiet revolution. Today, more than 500 tribal gaming operations bring in around $40 billion a year. Some tribes went from extreme poverty to funding schools, hospitals, and housing. The Seminoles of Florida bought the entire Hard Rock Cafe chain. The Mashantucket Pequot of Connecticut built one of the biggest casinos in the world on land where only a few families were left just decades earlier. Critics say not all tribes benefited equally. But for many Native people, casinos mean more than money. It's the chance to rebuild communities by their own rules, on the same lands people once tried to take from them. Number 15. Did you know the United States signed more than 500 treaties with Native tribes between 1778 and 1871? And here's the detail few people know. They didn't fully honor a single one of them. That's right, 0. The federal government promised permanent land, protection, and resources in exchange for peace. The tribes did their part. Washington didn't. The pattern kept repeating: sign the deal, wait a few years, find gold or fertile land in the promised territory, and then just tear up the agreement. The Cherokee lost their land in Georgia like that. The Sioux saw the same thing in the Black Hills when gold was found there. The Nez Perce were pushed out of Oregon for the same reason. Every broken treaty meant families forced out, cultures torn apart, and promises thrown in the trash. In 1871, Congress simply stopped making treaties. Easier than pretending they were going to keep them. This is the history that rarely shows up in school textbooks, but it defines how this nation was built. Number 16. Peyote was serious business for a lot of tribes. Long before any talk about drugs in the United States, Native peoples had been using peyote in sacred rituals for thousands of years. This small desert cactus contains mescaline, a substance that causes intense visions. But it wasn't a party or for fun. Healers and spiritual leaders used it in ceremonies that lasted all night with songs, prayers, and a fire. Tribes like the Comanche, Kiowa, and Navajo believed peyote opened a door to the spirit world, letting them see the future or find answers to problems in the community. The U.S. government tried to ban the practice multiple times. Only in 1994 did a federal law finally guarantee Native people the right to use peyote in religious contexts. Today, the Native American Church keeps this tradition alive, with thousands of members practicing ceremonies their ancestors were doing long before Columbus set foot on this continent. Number 17. Intertribal wars. Before white people. A lot of people think conflicts between tribes only started after Europeans showed up. That's not really true. Centuries before Columbus set foot in the Americas, indigenous nations were already fighting over territory, trade routes, and natural resources. The Iroquois and the Algonquin, for example, were longtime enemies in the Northeast. In the Southwest, the Navajo often clashed with the Pueblo peoples. These wars had their own rules and honor codes. Some tribes carried out quick raids, others organized bigger battles. What changed with the arrival of Europeans was the scale. Guns, horses, and disease completely shifted the balance of power between nations. Old alliances broke, new ones formed. Tribes that had never fought each other started competing for the same increasingly scarce resources. The history of Native peoples is much more complex than textbooks usually tell. Number 18. The biggest food contribution in history. Think about what you ate today. French fries, tomato sauce, popcorn? None of that existed in Europe before 1492. Indigenous peoples of the Americas developed farming techniques over thousands of years that turned wild plants into foods that still feed the world today. The numbers are wild. About 60% of the crops grown globally have their origins in the Americas. Corn was domesticated in Mexico more than 7,000 years ago from a grass that almost no one would even recognize. The potato, cultivated in the Andes, now feeds more people than wheat in many countries. The tomato, which Europeans thought was poisonous for decades, became the foundation of Italian cooking. Chocolate, squash, beans, avocado, peanuts, vanilla. Everything came from here. Without Native American agricultural knowledge, the world's diet would be completely different. They literally changed the menu of the entire planet. Number 19. Ancient DNA reveals a secret that rewrites history. Here's something that goes against everything we learned in school. Researchers analyzing DNA from ancient bones found something nobody expected. European genetic material in Native American populations dating back thousands of years before Columbus was even born. We're talking at least 24,000 years ago. Scientists discovered this by studying the remains of a boy in Siberia, whose people migrated to the Americas. That group already carried genes we now associate with Europeans. That means the ancestors of Native Americans had contact with Western Eurasian populations much earlier than we thought. It wasn't an invasion or conquest. It was simply people meeting and forming families during the big migrations of the Ice Age. The story of the first Americans is much more complex than what textbooks tell. Number 20. In 1680, a man named Popé did something no European general ever pulled off. He drove the Spanish out of New Mexico for 12 years. He brought together dozens of Pueblo tribes, people who didn't always get along, into a coordinated uprising that caught the colonizers completely off guard. The Spanish fled south and didn't come back for more than a decade. Today, Popé has a statue in the U.S. Capitol in Washington. Each U.S. state can place 2 figures in the National Statuary Hall, and New Mexico chose this indigenous leader as one of its representatives. He's the only Native American who led a successful rebellion against Europeans to receive that honor. Most Americans have never heard of him. They don't teach it in schools, it doesn't show up in movies. A guy who beat an empire and earned his place in the Capitol, but who still stays invisible in the history we tell.